My name's Matt, and I will be talking with Antoine Fourmont-Fingal about the importance of mindset in product management.
Man, so I really like to start with difficult questions. And I think you are the first one with whom I'm talking who work for Rocket Internet, Lazada, Alibaba. It's kind of like what I heard about those companies. It's like really specific work culture. So you need to be really hardworking, long hours. So it reminds me like a consulting, but more in a tech startup world. Is it true?
What is truth? Good question. I think I'll make a difference between Rocket, between Lazada and between Alibaba. The context being here that, Rocket is a German-based thing. Lazada was always Southeast Asian and was eventually incorporated into Alibaba Group. So about Rocket Internet. So it's funny that you asked because we realized with quite a few other people whom I've worked with in Lazada and would have didn't work with, but also evolved within the Rocket Internet universe, that we have a relationship with Rocket, which is a little bit like your mom. It's like it defines you in many ways, but you kind of hate it. And we found that was quite interesting to see that there was this thing where we would sort of trash it and sort of be very critical of it. But on the flip side, it would also very often still be upon reference. And it last job that I had, the last position, basically my CTO was also from Rocket, also from Lazada in that sense. And it's funny, like we kept on having discussions where it was, if it was a Lazada, this guy would have been, this and this would have happened, right? So it still feels like a very from a reference, and it is very driven. And to me, I think that the point about culture would be, yes, it's kind of hard, but I think it's not that specific to Rocket. What I saw in my time at Lazada was focus. It was basically this acceptation of the fact that if you want to create $1 billion worth of valuation within just a couple of years, in a sense of Machiavelli, if you want, it's not going to be nice every day. And if really this is why you're here, then everyone's going to have to be aligned towards this, especially senior management, and there will be very unpleasant moments. But those moments ought not to be lived like moral feelings or things like that, but rather as an expectable product of that relentless drive for speed. Okay? And so I would sort of requalify things a little bit like this because I think this is more appreciable. I'm not putting them as saints at all, right? I mean, there was a lot of like really funny characters down there. But I think what interesting in terms of culture is that not to look at the symptom, which is like, people working really hard, people are getting fired very often, companies are getting shut down for no reason, etc. But more a question of like, what was the purpose of this? And the purpose was that understanding, to me, that acceptation, that realization that there's not a second to leave, and being very, 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 very drilled down, right? So that's one point. The second point with Rocket is there was a clear preference from the outset for a certain cohort, right? So 30 years plus minus 2, 3, top 4 management consulting, and driven, but male, white, and just hit the sack, right? That's kind of true, and it has impact on the culture, right? In terms of framework and attitude, in terms of like work, I want to say ethics, but in terms of like endurance, if you want, right? So that's true. But it was not always great, I would say. You could criticize a little bit some things. I can give an example that to me was a bit of a criticism, is that it was very regional heavy in Lazada, which means that it was operating in 6 countries, and you had the headquarters that would be mostly in Singapore, although you had other regional offices in Bangkok and in Hong Kong, and very regional heavy. So quite a lot of people being like the heralds of best practices and things like this. And because we're trying to grow so fast and so hard, not everything was going perfect, and there were misses on objectives regularly, right? or there was basically problem statements. We can put it like this. And there would be that reflex of basically sending the regionals. And so everyone who was regional was spending their life on the plane. So what I mean by this is that not usual to hit 3 Southeast Asian countries in a week, which is not very good for your, life expectancy. But and so there would be that appearance and that performance of being like, regionals being on the ground. On the flip side, when I was there, and I remember sitting with local people in Indonesia in the office, and they were like, yeah, well, it's kind of funny. There is a new cohort of people that get parachuted every 3 months. They are trying to do what they think is right, but it's also a point about trying to shine from a regional standpoint because this is their rotation time. And then they leave, and then there's no dog cohort that comes, and, shit goes on. And that sort of got me this impression, and I think it's fairly correct. And something that I tried to avert in the next thing I did was to say that it felt very consultancy-ish, like drop boots on the ground. Yes, we're going to do it. Yes, perfect. We've understood everything, like 3 decks and no one's here anymore, right? And the fact that you can sort of almost reinvent the wheel regularly and in a more systematic or organizational fashion, I think it also pointed out to a relative weakness of the local teams, which I think didn't contribute very positively to the growth at some point. In the Southeast Asian context, every country is fairly specific. Take the example of Indonesia, everyone is very attracted by this from a venture capital perspective. It's like 250 million people. That's amazing. It's also like 14,000 inhabited islands. It's also like thousands of kilometers and horrible logistics, at least so you can sort of figure everything out from simple. So that's for Rocket, I would say. As for the Alibaba context, very, very different. To put, again, that into the best context possible. So relative to other people in the Lazada universe, I was relatively spared, at least in the local vocabulary, because I was in corners of the business that were a little less frontally impacted by this. And I'm not qualified to sort of do a generalization of the work ethics of the Ali group. I mean, that's topic of a book probably, but I can just share a couple of observations, right? I remember that there was something about focus and about drive, and there was something about a form of individual agency, basically. A form of almost extreme, it's a bit close to something that critics of neoliberalism would say, is to say, like, it's always, you have all of the cards to do whatever you want, so if you're not successful, it's your fault. That mentality, I think, was popping up quite often. There was this urban legend that it was about Jack Ma, the founder, and the urban legend wanted that someone had asked him what to do if, they were trying to do something and, they were not getting the support, etc. Like, could they escalate? And the legend wants that Jack Ma said, like, it's very simple. You can come to me the moment you've went with a knife in the office of the person that was not supporting you, and still that didn't work out. And so I think it's urban legend. I think, I'm pretty sure the original quote is probably a lot less brutal. But on the flip side, it has echoed a lot of everyone who worked with the Ali teams. There was a sense of absolute drive, and you got to make it work. And I think it's quite interesting because if from a leadership perspective, personally, I have this sort of a very empowering, like, I'm telling everyone who works with me, like, one of the most important things you can do is to know how to ask for help. And be very, being mindful and being quite self-aware in this is what will actually get you through pretty much everything, right? Because you can't achieve anything at all. And if you make that close to the Alibaba situation, and it gets a little bit tricky, right? Because is escalation help? Is it how will you formulate your situation in your problem statement so that it's not perceived as a lack of drive, but rather something where you need the support, right? I don't have the answer for this, but that's an interesting thing. Otherwise, I mean, there's a lot of spectrum, right? But especially in tech, between like command and conquer, like, top down versus bottom up versus like product mindset, etc. So that Lazada was not much of a tech company, to be honest. I think it was much more of finance and sales led company. Didn't matter where. I don't think it matters so much whether what we're doing was right or was beautiful. What mattered was that it worked, and it worked in time. On the Alibaba context, like one of the experience that one of the thing I spent the most time on was a replatforming exercise, which is a nice word to say that basically remove the entire tech stack of a company that was acquired and we replaced it with Ali technology. And here, in terms of ethics, I think what was interesting was that we did that within 5 months. And we're talking about a company, it's called Daraz. It's active in South Asia. It was at the time 2,000 employees in 5 countries. Pretty fast. And here, I think what was interesting is that it was a lot more tech-driven, but not so much in product mindset sort of what it was. There's a stack. The mandate is to get done with basically overturning everything within time. Go and do it. The value that we added was to question certain specific details of the implementation. And it was basically about what do we keep, what do we just throw away. I think in terms of ethics, what we could see is that, I mean, the most of the technical team was still based in China, and factually, yes, they were working pretty much all the time. And and even for us at Lazada, with that sort of supposedly, hardcore work culture, I mean, we're basically working 5 days weeks, while they were working 6 days weeks. But it's also got to be said in context that it was most people had been approached and sort of internally hired for this benefit of that specific project, and they were incentives that were fairly specific and that were also respecting the fact they were time-bounded, right? So it's not like people would maybe in certain parts of the business, but in what I've seen, those guys would not normally do 6 days weeks. But in the context of the replatforming, where there was a very hard deadline, like, okay, well, we'll do what we do. So does that help with the work culture?
I think you paint a pretty good picture and differentiations between those companies. But the funny thing is, like, we are now in Zurich. You're a French guy coming from around the Paris, and you worked and lived in Hong Kong for quite a while, like a few years, then in Tel Aviv, and now we are in Zurich. Your kind of specialty is all about the product, right? So I'm wondering commercial and product alignment, because I have a feeling that this is always a problem, right? There's so much push from the sales perspective, so much push for the new features. How do you deal with that? Or maybe do you see other issues that you address?
Big topic. I think maybe what's interesting is to dig just one thing, right? Which could be called synchronicity. It basically, to me, yes, there are challenges about this, but it stems, in my view, mostly out of misalignment. And so I would basically say that the direction that is going to improve this apparent disconnection between product and sales is in an alignment, and it starts with an alignment of objectives. So the one thing that I'm trying to do every time, and that we're doing in the last thing, was co-create the OKRs on a quarterly basis between product and whichever function this product team was working with, whether it could be at the team level or at the tribe level. So it was always an active co-creation. And I think to me that's fairly fundamental, because it helps a couple of things. It helps the commercial teams to feel heard, right? And to get a sense of really getting there. It also helps the product guys to not live on the cloud so much. It's great to do technology, but if it doesn't sell, honestly, like, what's the point? And it also helps to work together towards one of the challenging parts, which is to go past revenue as your metric of success. Now, that's the other thing also, which I think is structurally kind of challenging, is that it's very easy to get back to, okay, does it actually create revenue? And don't get me wrong, I think creating revenue is probably the most important thing, right? Alongside with, basically margin and a bit. But my point is, it's very rare that revenue is the one thing that you should track directly. I think that in terms of objective setting, I'm pretty sure that you can always find something which is a little bit more fine-grained, right? So you can look at, within your value chain of delivering the service that eventually generates the value, there is most probably multiple steps involved, right? So in any e-commerce concept, you're typically going to talk about a funnel, but you can generalize basically whichever line of events and of different nodes of value are delivered. And even if you want to keep it to a purely commercial standpoint, there's also different ways to look at this, right? The type of, like, the moment in the life cycle of our users, whichever the all users are, the group of users. So you can already get a little bit more fine-grained. Rather than saying, like, want to drive revenue, you can basically drive up activity within a certain moment of the user life cycle for a certain user cohort. And you're already getting a little more specific, right? And then I'm pretty sure that you can do that exercise systematically. And if you do that exercise systematically with commercial teams, or with any business team for that matter, and you will end up with OKRs which are not bullshit because they're not just revenue, and which you co-created, which is that then when we're going to start to look at the problem statement and the operative statements and say, like, okay, what do we do about this? There's a much higher chance that the commercial plan for the quarter and the product plan for the quarter are not antagonistic. They're actually complementary, right? Because we're trying to hit the same thing, right? And I would go as far as to say that the product teams, okay, so really, like, I think the O of the OKR should be the same. The KRs should have some overlap and should have things that are specific. To give you a very specific example, right? If I think that driving revenue this quarter is about dramatically changing the amount of sellers I have on my platform, right? And if we come to agree that part of this comes through the ability to deploy a sales team on the ground, the product team is not going to hire those guys, okay? It might be a KR. You might get to the point of saying, like, we actually need to have 10 extra people on the ground every week. Possible. The product team is not going to help out with this, right? So it doesn't make sense to get this KR to be relevant to the product team. However, the objective, which is that we need to radically change the landscape and the volume of sellers on the platform, this is something which is relevant to the product team. And then their KRs might be different, right? Maybe they're going to help with the ability to recruit or the ability to train people really rapidly, whatever that comes, right? But fundamentally, it's synchronicity. So basically two things is like co-create, and, whoever tells you that, it's all about revenue, say yes, but no.
And recently when we discussed, you mentioned really interesting concept. I mean, the product is more principles than books. Maybe could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to try to make it not philosophical, but we're having this conversation with a group of friends, and there was someone in the room was a little bit earlier in his career as a product leader, and there was a lot of questions about which framework and which book and which tools, and we came back to say, like, well, the thing with product in a way is that it's actually not that product specific. Like, it's a lot of mindset. There's a thing about continuous improvement. There is this sort of humility and this belief that most things we're going to do are not going to be completely true. They might be really horribly bad even. And it's about trying to figure that out as fast as possible. And it feels that doing this through an experiment and through, like, quantitative data is a sort of most often a safer way to do that rather than to go out of gut feels, right? There is, belief in flexibility and agility, things like that, but none of that is very specific to product. I mean, like, you would actually wish that most operations team in a manufacturing plant actually sort of work on the same principles, right? And there is a clear affiliation of things. And so what we're saying is there is like product is sort of, it seems that product is getting to a point which is kind of mainstream in a way. There's probably never been that many product people, or wannabe product people. And so there is also, and it also has become a label. And in a way, what I was saying here is, and some people are probably going to shoot me down on this, but it feels a bit like Agile. Agile started as a manifesto, it started as a set of principles that would probably be applied in many different ways. But now it's a 300K worth, training sold by corporate to other corporates. And I'm not saying this is wrong, but I'm saying that it feels that it's difficult to remain principle-based when there is so much like structure in place, right? And it's book, and there's this book, and there's this author, and it feels a bit religious at some point, right? There's the holy book, and there is the holder of the book, and there's the gospel, etc. And what I'm trying to say, I think, with product is, I think as product professional, we should be a bit mindful about this, because a lot of our value add to any business is a bit that skepticism and that critical mindset, which is a bit agnostic to this formalism, right? And I don't want to throw away all the books and frameworks. Like, I'm using some myself. I also think that trying to slap frameworks onto your reality is very often a factor of learning. But it's like, don't mistake the tree for the forest, right? I mean, you can do perfect OKRs. You can do like this perfect sort of experimentation thing. It's like in a lab, like, it's not because you have a perfect lab in Harvard that you're necessarily going to get up with something great. Like, you can still go straight in the wall. And so that's the thing, like, product is not mechanistic. You can't reduce it to like a set of practices. There is something about mindset. And the two things I would add, maybe in a bit of provocative manner, is we got to be especially careful, because on top of this, none of this actually is, in my view, really protecting the existence of a product function. Because the moment business people, salespeople even, start to say that, it's fine, I can talk to engineers, and they can have a meaningful, linguistically okay dialogue with engineers, there's a huge barrier of entry, which is going to just vanish. Because let's be, realistically speaking, a lot of companies' product are, from a very basic standpoint, the only people that are okay to talk with engineers. Okay? There's like, the Polish guy at the back, with like crazy tattoos and the huge headset. It looks a bit scary. No one wants to talk to this person. So, okay, like, the product is going to take care of it and try to sort of figure out what this person does, how to influence this person. The moment this is disappearing, like, why do you need a product in the first place? I can exemplify this in a way. Like, I've been both on the business side and on the product side all across like my short career. And if I end up, in a couple of years in a go-to-market, commercial role, I will have reflex of saying, like, to tell the product, dude, I don't need you to talk to engineers. Okay, so you're gonna have to provide me another value than just like, just talking to engineers. And you come back to principles. In a way, you come back with, what I would expect if I was a business leader from the product guy is to say, my functional area most probably induces biases around my way of viewing the world, because I have a very specific value to provide to the business in the value chain. So as a product person, you're here to counterbalance this with a horizontal view of the world, right? The second point that I would say, which is a bit, which you can be mindful, is, so as mainstream and as cool like product seems to be, we are also starting to get feedback about people being actually having bad experience with product. And people saying like, I even had a story which was quite interesting. A friend was working within I think it was a public company on top of this. I met that person that was, I don't remember the title, like improvement something. And that person was basically doing product. It was really about like trying to find the right insights, formulating the insights, structuring them, helping people to take the right decisions. That's textbook product. Like, we're here to take good decisions or enable people to take good decisions. And my friend was like, oh, it's great. Like, like this is totally product. And the person had a very violent emotive reaction. Like, no, I'm not product. Like, product is the other douchebag here. I'm not this. And so I think we need to be careful because there's a plausible link between this dogmatism threat, the mainstream fact, and this very emotional reaction of like, well, those are, those dogmatic guys that under the pretext of software is eating the world, as enthusiastic as I am and will probably remain for the product mindset and this horizontality, this humility and skepticism, there's a clear risk of dogmatism and of, entrenchment of things that I think is detrimental on multiple levels. Make sense?
Makes sense. I want to ask you because you have a pretty good view on the Asian market. You spend there quite a bit, and you still work with those guys there. And last year it was like a huge recession in big tech. So for the first time, we have seen it after so many years. And I'm just wondering, do you experience it in Asia? Do you hear it from friends there? What influence it has on the companies there?
Yeah. So I can share things from the Southeast Asian context and the Central Asian context. From a Southeast Asia perspective, I also hear things are difficult. A lot of people were laid off, difficult markets. It is to be contextualized. I think it's still, it's related, right? So maybe it still grows, but a bit less fast as it did at some point. There's clearly a lot of people on the bench. Talking to friends in Singapore, etc. But there's also a lot of smaller movements here and there. So Singapore recently, there was a bit of a realistic correction to it, which got it to be a lot more expensive. So people sort of left. There's also Hong Kong where a lot of people left because they were scared. And so some of those guys are spread in the region and so are generating other things. So it's hard to realize, but recession is probably half fact, half belief, and at least the belief part. I would say that at least the belief part in the Singapore context looks plausible. From a Central Asian perspective in the Middle East, I don't remember really anything about recession. I think it's more geopolitics. As you know, the 24th of February 2022 changed everything, and it had pretty big repercussion on the region. And typically, the Central Asian area became a lot more relevant and interesting for Russian interests, which are not able to flow westwards anymore. And talk about something that I know from an Uzbekistan perspective, actually, it's not, the recession is completely irrelevant. On the contrary, it's completely booming. Out of a lot of Russian investment, but not only. And it's super dynamic. It's not necessarily true of all of the adjacent markets, but it's also, no, actually, that probably is still true. It's just that it materialized a little bit differently. And Uzbekistan is, I think, the locus of a bit of a more specific enthusiasm out of its size and population. The fact that it was still closed until 2016. And so, the ramp is just quite crazy versus places like Kazakhstan is a bit richer in terms of natural resources and started its sort of development or the most recent phase of development a bit earlier. And as for Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, they're smaller countries. I mean, Turkmenistan is anyway closed. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, those are smaller countries. But even Kyrgyzstan, there's really interesting development there. So I don't think that recession really resonates in that region. On the flip side, think about places like Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. and Pakistan, that was tougher. I mean, Lebanon and Pakistan, for sure, those two countries are hit by not only like a global standard, but local challenges. I think the bullet point of this would be that in Southeast Asia, probably at least a perceived challenge, and it's materialized by a lot of layoffs. And at some point, those people are looking for jobs, etc., and it's just harder to just move on. And in the Central Asian Middle East context, not relevant at all to Central Asia, in my view, but however, a much deeper geopolitical impact on things. And the influence of China, the influence of Russia into this, much bigger.
I'm wondering what was your biggest challenge in your career regarding product delivery, maybe like anything related to your career, and what you have learned from it?
Someone recently told me that I was really, really good, and maybe I was even obsessed with putting myself in the shit so that I could actually do fun stuff. And that comes to mind because I'm like, okay, like everything has been challenges, right? Maybe let's call it. There's many different things, right? But if I'm gonna reorient the question a little bit and saying like, what's been a personal challenge probably so far, and maybe the one thing that I can share as a bit of a story, which I think was fairly recent in that got me somewhere. 2022 in August, the 11th of August to be exact, I had to sack 7 people out of 21 on the team, and within a few weeks, I lost another 3. And that got me within the big months. In August, September 2022, that got me to lose around, I think I calculated, I lost 44% of my team effective, right? And that was far from nice, right? I have vivid memories of, having a call at the end of the day and just basically getting everyone on camera, which we're doing quite not that frequently, and basically telling them that despite the respect and the admiration I had for what they had done, this time had come, and I was basically giving them their freedom back, right? And so a lot of anger, a lot of also internecine sort of fights around this. I found that one thing was difficult is there was an attempt, I think, within senior management to sort of not really bear responsibility collectively, which is shit. But what was interesting, though, is 1 year later, I came to realize from talking to someone that the team actually, not only had we managed to keep the boat afloat, although, it's like, but we also got better at what we were doing. And so we had not cut a lot of things. We just got collectively a lot more intention. And I think that to me is the biggest learning in a way is my point basically, we had reached something as a team to get to a point where it was anti-fragile or basically resilient to adversity and ambiguity enough that such a traumatic shock, in a sense, not only it didn't stop us, but it also actually got us to improve our craft. And you're like referring on to Nassim Taleb and, the anti-fragile and all of the things. That was, out of a really challenging experience where basically we lost a lot of people. I managed to capture 3 extra resources after losing 9. 2 internally that had never been PMs that we had to train on the spot, basically within a couple of weeks. Another one where magically appear right at the correct moment, and we made it. And so what was interesting is we got maybe a bit tougher, but instead of basically crumbling down, instead of starting to not to do half of what we wanted to do, or starting to do it in a not in a non-qualitative way, factually we just kind of got better. And a funny thing is, a few people that I shared that with were like, oh yeah, that's basically, you basically had way too much fat on your team. or like the people are doing nothing. And I personally don't believe this, because to give you a sense, right? So we went with 15 product teams, and we never had 15 product people to actually take care of each of the teams, right? And we got from, I think, 11 to 7 product. And so it's like, I hardly can believe that, in our context where we didn't even have enough people to take care of all of the teams that were like proper practices with the business team in front, it was really a question of fact. I think it was a question of practices and a question of collaboration, a question of concentrating on what matters, basically, and sort of eating your own fucking dog food, if you allow me the expression. And you say like, storm's coming, it's going to be tough, but we don't want to take that as an excuse to sort of like, throw everything in the wind. What matters now is to be quite selective and very disciplined about what we want to do. It entails upgrading people. It entails training people right on the spot and being very, again, intentional about the decisions. So the cap off would be what started as like a fairly kind of traumatic experience, like watched, firing act, expanded, just so many people out, ended up at a catalyst and a sort of funny moment that kind of proved the fact that we're just not serious people. We're actually a team. Maybe we can even call it a collective that was able to get better through adversity. And to me, I think it basically got me to think that this is what you want to do as a leader. You want to concentrate on building those teams that even if shit hits the fan, they actually got better. So I'm going to digress for a second here because it's kind of related and funny. I had this argument with a friend. It was about the next week's way, and their proposed practice of firing the bottom 10% of the people every year or every semester. I don't remember, right? And I was like, this is shit. And my argument is this. If you tell people you're going to fire the bottom 10% of them every year, you instill and maintain a climate of ambiguity and fear. You're going to basically keep people on their feet, right? And I understand part of this because I do think that you have to get people past their comfort zone so that they actually get a chance of being anti-fragile and have a chance of growing in the face of adversity rather than, cracking. However, I don't think firing them is the best thing. In the sense of there is basically there's a lot of criticism, but it feels like a bit indiscriminate. On the contrary, I do believe in a bit like an elite sport coach of taking your team way past its comfort zone to a point where they might be close to breaking. And maybe I sound like Rocket here, but I'm also calibrated pain, basically. And I think it also applies to teams, say, as long as you have their back and you're generally trying to calibrate, you will fail sometimes, but if you're generally trying, it's okay to have, sweats, blood and tears to an extent, because it will definitely make them a better collective. Makes sense? And the act of firing the bottom 10%, to me, it does, it creates part of this environment, but it doesn't create for the teams, it only created for the individuals. And so as such, like, you may push some people up, but you're not going to create an horizontal emergent property. At least that would be my belief. And a digression, sorry.
No, it makes sense. Antoine, so I have the last question. I'm just wondering, could you recommend any books, resources, conferences that have been particularly influential on your career, that you had maybe this aha moment?
Right. I read quite a lot, so I'd say a few things. So I quoted Nassim Taleb. I think that even if you think that he writes like a prick, and it maybe is a prick, the thing is that it's probably true. What's equally probably true is that it's a very smart prick, and there's a couple of things here. So I can relate a lot of basic conceptions through a lot of the things that he's explained. It's nothing new, like you can do Marcus Aurelius meditation since you prefer to have the hard Stoic things, but I think he puts it into a modern context, which is interesting. So I would definitely recommend that. It's gonna sound a little bit like maybe funny, but I would recommend everyone to read Machiavelli and to read around Machiavelli. So, everyone probably would have a good time reading The Prince, but I would not stop there. I would try to read articles around Machiavelli and articles also related or directly to text of other texts from Machiavelli. Because I think that is vastly misunderstood. I think that basically Machiavelli has rarely said anything goes. On the contrary, I think Machiavelli argues for a very fine-grained evaluation of what emergency means. And this is something that everyone in our society can benefit from, in my opinion. And I think that Machiavelli warns us against pseudo-emergency. He also, and it's related to the firing story, I think he warns us against too much telling and not enough showing. And it's something that I come back to quite often. And if you want to make it 3, very classic, but Think Fast and Slow from Kahneman is something that, unfortunately for you, cannot be avoided. It's just, there's a lot of fundamentals. And maybe I'm going to add a false bonus because it's a little less classic and maybe it could be useful to people that are from the product stance. I've recently read a book called Range by someone called Dave Epstein. And I was quite reluctant at the beginning. So it's like another American business book with, like 10 pages worth of content and 200 pages worth of like blah, blah. It's very readable. And I think there's a lot of pretty good points about how we learn, about the value of drawing connection between disciplines, about history, a couple of cool stories about how things were developed. There's cool stories typically about chess and AI. There's a good story about Nintendo. It was very inspiring. I find there was a couple of moments where like, okay, I'm not going to try to write my one pager anymore. I'm just going to send people reading like chapter 11 because it does a really good job at explaining a couple of things that I sort of would believe as fundamental, such as the generalist part of product, right? So that's something that I would recommend.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Anton, for the really interesting talk.
Cheers.
Follow Matt on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Better Tech Leadership newsletter.